Hey there, welcome into this episode of KOIN Conversations. I'm morning anchor Travis Tyke. We are talking about one of the most infamous eras, not just maybe in Portland sports history, but Portland history here. The Jailblazers era is what we're talking about here on this episode of KOIN Conversations. Now, coming to Netflix next month is a documentary about this infamous team of the late 90s and the early 2000s, of course known as the Jailblazers. This is all part of Netflix's Untold documentary series. So as one of these documentaries, the Jailblazers being featured in this documentary, that one's hitting streaming on April 14th. So we got to talk about it. Figured there is nobody better to talk about this team with than the man who literally wrote the book on the Jailblazers, Kerry Eggers. It's great to have you in studio, Kerry.
Thanks for having me, Travis.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. I just finished your book over the weekend, so it's fresh in my brain. You came out with this book in 2018, and before we dive on into it, just what was it like putting this book together over this team that you've covered for so long?
Well, it was difficult because this wasn't an issue that a lot of people wanted to talk about. You know, while they were proud of the accomplishments on the court, most of them, they were not proud of the other stuff, or at least they shouldn't have been. And so there were some people that I tried to interview, that Rasheed Wallace, J.R. Ryder, Bonzi Wells. There's stories behind all those that none of them talk. But, you know, I talked to about 25 players. I talked to all the coaches, many of the assistant coaches, staff personnel. I got a great insight to what really went on, and I think it's a very accurate portrayal of what happened during about a 10-year period. I figured from about 96 to 2006 or 7.
Yeah, and it's a team that so many people are familiar with, but it has more ebbs and flows than I even remembered. And I grew up here. I watched this team. You know, the late 90s teams I wasn't as familiar with, just being a little young, but those 2000s teams with Zach Randolph, Bonzi, Damon Stoudemire, Rasheed, I remember them very, very well. It was interesting to get a look into it. So we're going to dive into that book here in just a minute. But with your interviewing process, putting this Jailblazers book together, what stood out to you in your interviews? Who really grabbed you while you were talking to them as they were reflecting on this team so many years later?
Well, of the players, I was impressed most with Gary Trent, who was the bad boy. And the thing that I was impressed with was that he was willing to admit that, hey, we deserved that tag. No, we weren't actually in jail, but we did a lot of transgressions that we shouldn't be proud of, myself included. And he gave me a pretty accurate portrayal of what he thought during that time. A lot of other players didn't really, like even Steve Kerr, who I should point out that many of these players that are in this book are good people. I went through last night, Sabonis, Steve Kerr, Chris Dudley, Jermaine O'Neal, Brian Grant, Dale Davis, Derek Anderson, and I'd put even Damon Stoudemire in that group of good citizens, you know, good people. Yeah. So it wasn't all a bunch of convicts, so to speak. So, but Gary was willing to admit that they made some mistakes. Some of the other guys were not, and that's too bad. So Gary was certainly one of the guys. I would also say some of the assistant coaches, Dan Panaggio, not a big name, but Dan gave me a wonderful insight as to some of the things that happened. He was a Maurice Cheeks sort of towards the end of it. Another guy, Bobby Medina, was the strength and conditioning coach. He was a great source. He knew everybody. So those are probably some of the ones that stand out to me.
Yeah. Again, you have this book out in 2018, The Jailblazers. You can still find that out now, by the way. You put this together in 500 pages, and this Netflix documentary is coming out in April, and they're telling this story in less than an hour. How does it, in your opinion, what does this documentary need to show to be accurate, to be true to what the Jailblazers era was like for fans and for the team?
Well, not just the, quote, player's side, which I'm afraid is what you're going to see. I've been told by the producer that they came out and did a long interview with me. They did the same with Dwight Jaynes, and I'm told they're not going to use any of it. They just wanted to have the player's side. So I don't think you're going to get a totally accurate picture of what happened. Go to my Jailblazers book. You'll get an accurate portrayal.
Interesting. How would you describe that Jailblazers era, having covered it yourself in real time?
Well, I mean, it was tumultuous because on the one hand, they were a pretty good team, especially that 1999 to about 2001. Those guys, you know, should have probably won a championship. But character was an issue, and I think most of the people knew that. And you had Rasheed Wallace setting records for technicals. You had a lot of off-court stuff that was going on. Reuben Patterson was involved in a lot of stuff. You had the Patterson-Zach Randolph fight that was so celebrated in practice where Reuben's eye socket was knocked out. And the dog fighting. There were just so many incidents and a lot of drug arrests, even though some people think now that's overblown. Well, in those days it was illegal. In some parts of the country it's still illegal. So I don't think that's justified by saying that times have changed.
Sure. With the documentary in mind too, I mean, this is such a prevalent piece of Portland history. I don't think just sports history. I think this was such a piece of Portland history, this era of this team. Can zoom out here with a look across the NBA or across the rest of the country, and again maybe with this documentary in mind. What do you think people who are not familiar with this era of the Trailblazers, and maybe there's a Knicks fan that has never cared about the Blazers, being from the Big Apple, who are going to be maybe surprised to hear some of these stories? How well versed is the sports world in the Jailblazers era?
Probably not as well as they were 20 years ago, because
Yeah.
it's sort of ancient history. But I think they'll be interested, especially if it's an accurate portrayal of all the stuff that happened. I'm leery to say that it's going to be a very accurate portrayal, but it is kind of fascinating to think about all the things that happened to them, mostly off the court. But then you have Bonzi Wells getting ticked off about getting a technical and throwing a stick, taking a stick of gum out of his mouth, throwing it up, hitting a guy in the chest, and it bouncing onto a lady's lap. I mean, and then the Blazers had to apologize for that. I mean, there was just a lot of turmoil during that time, Travis.
Yeah. What I remember during that era, again, as a kid myself, I remember exactly what you have on the cover here, which is Rasheed yelling. Like this is my memory as a Blazers fan as a kid in the early 2000s. The technicals, I remember the Rasheed technicals. But getting this inside look into what I really appreciated about your book is that you didn't just list a rap sheet. You told stories. You went into everybody's background. Right, like with Zach Randolph, we knew about some of the issues, but you talked about his upbringing in Indiana and how that may have shaped him, and I think that's really, really insightful. Why did you feel the need to go and dig into the backgrounds of all of these players in your book?
Oh, I wanted to be as thorough as possible, and I'm glad you mentioned Zach because, honestly, he was one of my favorites. I mean, he was so polite. He was great to deal with. But he had a terrible background, as did Gary Trent and some of these guys. That's part of the reason that these guys' comportment was the way it was, because they were not a lot of single-parent families and that sort of thing. So, but Zach's had a good appreciation of how to be polite, and yet in his off-court stuff, he had a lot of issues. So. Yeah. It was fun to get to know some of these people, and I did feel it was important to, dig into the Arvydas Sabonis background, for instance, and some of the players that Damon Stoudemire, who I knew very, very well, and I had a very soft spot for. I knew him since his sophomore year at Wilson High School, covered him, and gosh, I remember flying up to Toronto when he was a rookie and spending a couple hours, and he stayed, actually, he lived in the Sky Dome that year.
Really?
Yeah, and I think the arena must have been right next door. And
my
so,
gosh.
yeah, and I remember looking down at the Sky Dome, and so Damon and I had a great relationship, and he of course has had some issues too. So, but it was fun to get to know some of those guys, not so much Rasheed.
Yeah. Well, speak to Rasheed. I mean, because he, to me, is the biggest. I don't know if enigma is the right word, but you talk about the guy who he was on the floor, the technicals, the temper, right? I mean, we saw it play out in real time. Of course, maybe his most famous line of all time, CTC, cut the check, all of that. But you also...
Ball don't lie is another one.
What's it? Yeah, ball. Yeah, that's also a big one. That's one that is still in my lexicon to this day. I'll say ball don't lie. Ball don't lie. But you also showed moments where after these games where he may have even been ejected, but you could see him with players' families playing with kids, and he's always been, after his career ended, very active in respective communities. I'll always remember he was very involved during the Flint, Michigan water crisis. He stepped up in a big way there. What was it like to cover Rasheed Wallace?
Well, first of all, I should say, almost to a man, they all loved him as a teammate. All the players thought he was a great teammate. Now, he wasn't a great guy to play for. I mean, to coach, I should say. Especially if you ask Mike Dunleavy, who had a locker room altercation that's described in the book. But he was a good player who perhaps didn't work hard enough during the off season. He was always pretty skinny, and he a couple of years he just paid the training staff off. Here, what? I'm going to get $100,000 in fines. I'm not going to do any of the weightlifting sessions. Come on, Are you kidding? I'll never forget the time when he threw a towel in the face of Sabonis during a timeout when they were playing the Lakers. And that was just criminal. You don't do that with a teammate, and so. He could be a good interview if he wanted to be. In fact, one time I did a magazine piece with him and had arranged it, prearranged it, and so he gets up. I say, "Can we do the interview now?" He says, "Yeah." So he starts walking. So I'm following, and I'm thinking I'm going to get about 5 minutes with him. We're going to his car. Stood at his car. Did talk for a half hour. He was fine.
Wow.
So he could be fine. He just didn't choose to be. Didn't like to deal with the media. He thought they were against him. I thought the media was pretty soft on him, really, here in Portland.
Really? Why is that?
Because I don't think the Portland media in general is like New York or some of the big cities that really, I think they embrace the team pretty much. And, I take a positive look, I guess you would say. Certainly they're not going to be cheerleaders, but on the other hand, I don't think they're going to be as delving into the problems as some cities.
Yeah. And with that in mind, it made me think of, a piece of your book where you highlight the payroll. I cannot imagine a world where a small market team has the biggest payroll in their sport in this day and age. How unique was that to Portland?
It was, and Paul Allen was willing to pay anything. I mean, they had the first plane, they had the best first really nice locker room and training facility, I should say.
Yeah.
However, he would cut costs on other things like do you remember when they laid off? Was it 120 employees? Right about when they were going to bankrupt the arena. So. I would say maybe Paul wasn't a great guy to work for unless you're a player.
Well, let's talk about the man who reported to him, General Manager Bob Whitsitt at the time. You detail quite a bit in your book, and you also show the back and forths in the columns that Dwight Jaynes had. You share some of those. I did highlight what is maybe his Bob Whitsitt's most famous quote, which you lead off here in chapter 6, which is titled Mike Dunleavy. But the quote from Bob Whitsitt here is, quote, "I wasn't a chemistry major in college. I was a sports major." That being a reference to, basically just taking all the talent, regardless of price tag, regardless of possible chemistry that would be in a locker room, and throwing them together and putting it on the coach to kind of make it work. And you talk about all these different eras of the coaches, PJ Carlesimo, Mike Dunleavy, Maurice Cheeks. Is there any coach, in your opinion, that could have made this team, that roster, work?
Well, maybe Phil Jackson because he had such great respect, but
Sure.
I thought Dunleavy was the best coach in that group. Nate McMillan caught the end of it, too.
Yeah.
I thought Nate was pretty good, too, but Mike almost got it there, and he knew how to handle players pretty well. In the end, maybe Rasheed and him, maybe that tipped it the wrong way. But I'm not sure anybody could. Now, I should say this. None of the coaches complained about having great talent. You would never get them to say that. I'd much rather have great talent and try to work with it with some behavioral issues than have lousy talent with some great people. So,
What I think is interesting, too, is you had several quotes from players in here, and I want to get your take on it. And maybe the era has changed, or maybe I've been living under a rock. But I've also been, our paths have crossed through sports journalism, Kerry. Now, of course, your career, much longer, much more esteemed in the sports journalism circles. But, getting these quotes from players who are so open about the fact that there is too much talent. I'm not playing. We have issues. What was that energy like, I guess, at the time when you are talking to players who are open to the media saying they're frustrated? I just don't feel like we have that this day and age.
no, there's not as much transparency. There's not enough availability for the media. We were able to sit down. Two guys come to mind in what you were just saying. Scottie Pippen was fantastic about being honest. he leveled Whitsitt several times in interviews with me, and I used a lot of that stuff. Now, Scotty wouldn't talk to me for the book, but we used a lot of the stuff he had said through that era. The other guy is Ruben Patterson, who had the issue where he was cold-cocked in a fight by Jack Randolph and broke an orbital bone. And when I interviewed him that next year, actually I interviewed him right after that, but especially the next starting in training camp, I asked him how he felt. He says, well, I got to play with a guy, but you just want to kill him. Can you imagine? I'm surprised he didn't get fined or anything.
Yeah.
You're not going to see players say that nowadays, and there's more to it. I can't remember exactly what he said, but there was an opportunity to get direct quotes then that I don't think the media has very often today.
Why is that, do you think?
Because they make so much money, and also social media, they can do their own talking if they want to.
That's true.
They don't really, quote, need the media anymore. And the other thing is, for some reason, public relations people now are protecting them rather than help facilitating them. And I think it's still, there are some still good PR people, but more and more are more in the protection mode.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do want to get your take, too, on that 1999-2000 team. The way especially reading your book, the way I feel like the Jailblazers era is defined, it kind of really feels like there are two parts. It feels like there was the 90s era, and then there was a break. There was a break there with like the 99-2000 team. Of course, we all know the infamous Game 7 in the Western Conference Finals. It's hard to talk about in this town. That's one of my first Blazer memories as a kid is that game. And then Whitsitt, changes the dynamic, which is something that Scottie Pippen in your book is very vocal against. He was really against Whitsitt coming in and changing up that dynamic in the 99-2000 team. And then you have kind of part two in the aughts there with, like we said, Bonzi and Zebo and those guys. If the Blazers win Game 7 of the 99-2000 Western Conference Finals, how different is not only the Jailblazers era, but maybe the Blazers franchise today?
Could have been very different, Travis. I think they'd have beaten Indiana in the finals. Probably wouldn't have traded Brian Grant. Wouldn't have acquired Sean Kemp, who, unfortunately, I really like Sean as a person, but had a cocaine problem and an eating problem, and that was a terrible trade. They got Dale Davis for Jermaine O'Neal. Dale was a good guy too, but not a good trade. So he made some bad trades there, and I don't know if you'd call it a panic, but just moves that they shouldn't have made. But had they won, I think they'd have kept it together, and maybe they'd have won another title or two. And you're right, people would have overlooked all the misbehaviors because they had what they had accomplished on the court.
Yeah. Another question I have about the misbehaviors too, and you alluded to this earlier, and I bookmarked this quote because I thought that this was interesting. This coming from J.R. Ryder, and he got quite a bit of flack for this at the time. But what you brought up earlier were some of the marijuana charges and how that it was just a different time. Right? It's legal in Oregon now. It wasn't legal then. But some people look at this Jailblazers era and they say it's really unfair. Some charges I think, clearly more serious than others, if you have domestic violence cases, and then you have some that are the marijuana charges. There's Damon Stoudemire bringing marijuana through an airport. I remember watching that on the morning news as a kid. And a lot of people for a long time have said that, there's a lot of racial unfairness that comes through with the Jailblazers. And one, want to get your take on that, and two, react to this, what is now a nearly 30-year-old quote from J.R. Ryder, which you lead off here with Chapter 3 in your book, Chapter 3 being Not So Easy Ryder. And the quote is, quote, "We can go 40 miles down the road, and they're probably still hanging people from trees," end quote. Obviously, really poignant comment. He eventually took that back. But what is your opinion, having covered the team, having written this book, this team probably better than anybody, to look at it through was there a racial injustice lens that was used during this time?
I can go through all the transgressions. I wrote some down. You don't have time, Travis, for me to talk about them all. If you collect all those, there's no way you're going to say it's racist, okay? And that charge by JR was just silly. There was also an interview that Rasheed Wallace did with the Oregonian during that time, and he really let loose on the NBA, calling him a racist, organization. He says, I'm not no dumbass N-word. And that got a lot of attention from David Stern. I don't think he ever got suspended for that. He had several other suspensions, but there were so many suspensions for all those players. And so that's one part of the issue. The other part is, okay, how about the smoking pot? Okay, well, not that big a deal probably, but you're driving down the car in a Hummer from after a game in Seattle, and the coach Cheeks lets them drive to Portland, and they're smoking pot while they're driving, which you probably shouldn't be doing, right? So is that okay? And I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, I don't agree with any of the racist stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, before we switch gears, and we're going to talk about your newest work, Scrolls of a Sports Scribe, I just want to get your lingering thoughts. It's been 20-plus years since that Jailblazers era. Again, the documentary on Netflix coming out April 14th. You have your book here, Jailblazers, which came out in 2018. Highly recommend for anybody who's a fan or just a sports fan, or maybe you're like myself. You live through this era and you just want a clearer picture of it. Just reflect on it. What was it like to put the book together, to cover this team? What do you think of when you think about that team here now?
Well, they only had 15 players, but I don't think you'll ever each year they only had 15 players. Through the whole time there was probably 30 or so. But I don't think you'll find another team again that had that many issues, behavioral issues, ever. Mm-hmm. A general manager would not allow that to happen because comportment is so important in on-field success, on-court success, and also the image that you have with your fans, who are the ones that are watching on TV and buying tickets. So what was it like? It wasn't easy a lot of the times, because you go into that locker room after a game and there's only 3 or 4 guys that you really wanted to go to. The other guys that give you the brush off. So there were difficult times, but it certainly was interesting. It was never boring, I guess you would say.
Yeah, fair enough. Again, you can go find the Jailblazers. Where can people find the Jailblazers?
Well, I'm out of it on my website. I may be getting some more here with it. So check KerryEggers.com, and we'll see what we can do, and we can get you an autographed copy of it, too.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Okay, that's not the only work that Kerry's been working on. Of course, now out as of November, Scrolls of a Sports Scribe, his latest works. So we're going to talk about that coming up on the other side of this break. Stay with us. Hey, welcome back to KOIN Conversations. I'm morning anchor Travis Tyke. We are talking with sports writer Kerry Eggers, who is out with his new book. It's out in November. This last November it came out. It's called Scrolls of a Sports Scribe, and it's a pretty interesting look at your career, Kerry. You're detailing so many stories that you have covered, and so many interviews that you have had over your 50-year career. What have you concocted here with Scrolls of a Sports Scribe?
Well, when I retired from the Portland Tribune, Travis, in 2020, I thought, it'd be fun to put together a collection of my stories in a book. So I went through all my stories. I had clippings from all my stuff with the Oregon Journal and the Oregonian, most of them, and then papers from the Tribune, and then, of course, the last 10 years or so, you get it off the websites, right? So off the Internet. So I went through and I picked out, for 3 months, I picked out about 250 stories, and I said, that's too many. so I narrowed that. And by the way, in the interim, I started a website, and then I realized I don't have time. And then I wrote 3 more books, and so I never got to this project. And then last year I thought, hey, I'm not getting any younger. I probably better get this. So I've got 120 stories I put in as a 2-volume set, 60 in each, a variety of stories, national type stuff, a lot of local stuff too, but stories with Wilt Chamberlain and Muhammad Ali and Tiger Woods, and then of course a lot of NBA stuff and profile type things. Not too many game type stories, although I have the 90 and 92 finals, NBA finals games. Mm-hmm. A lot of Clyde Drexler, and a lot of Bill Walton. So I think people in Portland in particular will enjoy reading some of these stories.
What stands out to you when you think about what you had to whittled down? I know I can't imagine what was left on the cutting room floor.
Well, it's funny. My wife goes, "Well, you still got enough for volume 3," and we were laughing about that. I don't know if that'll ever see fruition, but honestly, I'm not trying to sound egotistical, but there was some pretty good stuff in there that we didn't get in. But so and in fact, there were some stories that my wife said you should have used, and I said, well, it was a hard pick, but we have some good stuff in there, I think.
Yeah. At first I was going to ask you what your favorite story is, which is probably like asking to pick your favorite child. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to rephrase that and say, if when people read your scrolls of a sports scribe, which story do you think people are going to be talking about the most? What do you think is going to stand out to them?
Well, let me preface this with each story. It's not just reprinted stories. It's also 2 or 3 paragraphs in a preface telling how the story came about. Let me just give you one example. Wilt Chamberlain, we're sitting in the office at the Oregonian, 1997. It was going to be the 35th anniversary of Wilt's 100-point game.
Wow!
And so somebody said, "Wouldn't it be great to do a story with Wilt?" And so Ken Wheeler, who had covered the Blazers, wasn't at that time, but he was in the office. I said, "Kenny, do you have a number for Wilt Chamberlain?" Sort of flippantly. And so he said, "Well, I do have a number here, but it might be old. And what are the chances you're going to get Wilt anyway?" So I did a little background, a half hour. We didn't have the internet in those days, or maybe it was just in the early stages. But so I call the number, and Wilt answers. And I said, Kerry Eggers from the Oregonian, Wilt, you got a big milestone coming up tomorrow. I'm doing a story on it. Could I talk to you? Well, no, I don't have time. I'm going to dinner. Oh, well, and I hung him on the phone. I said, could I just ask a couple questions? Got him in, got a couple more in. He gave me about 20 minutes, got a pretty good story out of it. So, so I prefaced it with that, and then at the postscript, he told me about a book that he was writing. I went out and bought the book just to read it. Sure enough, he wrote a book. I can't remember what it was called. And he died just a couple of years after that. So,
oh my gosh.
So anyway, that's just an example of how our stories came together. And for almost every story, I've got a preface and a postscript. As far as stories that people will be talking about, perhaps that one, perhaps Muhammad Ali. I thought a Mike Tyson story was pretty interesting. Tanya Harding and I have a strange relationship. We get along real good. And I covered her first pro boxing bout in the Pyramid in Memphis on an undercard of a Mike Tyson fight. He fought a tomato can named Clifford Etienne and knocked him out in the first round. But afterwards, I've never been in a press conference like this. It was like a psychiatrist session. And of course, there was people laughing. There was all these fans that somehow got into the press room and were cheering with all these sad stuff that he was saying about himself. And so I think I wrote a pretty good piece on that, and that's in the book.
That is amazing. That's really great. And then you have some local stars that you were saying too. I in my quick glances, I saw stories from Pat Casey, of course.
Yeah, a lot of Beaver baseball with Stephen Kwan, Adley Rushman, Travis Bizzana, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's really, really great. How does it feel to put this together?
Yeah.
To go through your entire career and to make decisions on what to include, what to exclude, and then just to publish this. What was this like?
It was really fun. Thanks for asking. It's because you forget about so much. I mean, somebody asked me how many stories I've written, and I kind of figured up around 15,000, including magazine pieces. We did a lot of magazine stuff in the 90s when magazines were big. So it was fun to put this stuff together and to sort of relive some of those memories and to have that sort of legacy to say, hey, I wrote a book about what I wrote about.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. Where can people find Scrolls of a Sports Scribe?
Well, just on my website, kerryeggers.com. Go to the store tab on the homepage, fill out an order form. If you have any trouble, message us and we'll help you process it. We'll get you a book quickly.
I love it. Kerry, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Travis.
It's been really fun to rehash all this. Yeah, really do appreciate it.